The Great Plains stretch across the center of North America in a way that feels almost endless. Wide skies, long horizons, slow-moving clouds, and land that seems to breathe with time itself. For thousands of years, this region has been home to many indigenous nations, each with its own language, worldview, and oral traditions. These stories were not written to frighten, impress, or entertain in the modern sense. They were told to teach awareness, respect, balance, and understanding of the world. Many of the stories connected to the Great Plains are quiet in tone. They do not rely on spectacle. Instead, they speak through symbols, metaphors, and gentle warnings. They often begin with ordinary situations: a traveler walking alone, a family moving across open land, a person ignoring a small sign. And from these ordinary beginnings, meaning slowly unfolds. One recurring idea across multiple plains traditions is that the land itself is aware, not in a literal or human way, but as a living system that responds to attention, respect, and balance. Stories often describe the plains not as empty space, but as a place full of presence. Wind, grass, animals, and sky are all part of a shared relationship. Because of this worldview, many traditional stories speak about what happens when people lose awareness of their surroundings. These stories are not warnings of danger in a modern sense. They are lessons about attentiveness, humility, and respect. In some oral traditions, elders spoke of travelers who lost the path, even though the land around them looked familiar. The phrase did not always mean being physically lost. Often it described a state of confusion, distraction, or disconnection. A person could walk in a straight line and still be considered lost if they were no longer attentive to signs, rhythms, or responsibilities. These stories were often told quietly, especially to younger listeners, as reminders rather than threats. In several Plains traditions, there are symbolic accounts of people who wandered too far from their group or ignored subtle signals from the environment. The stories describe how such individuals became disoriented, confused, or separated, not because something attacked them, but because they stopped listening. One common theme involves the idea of forgetting the way back. This does not always refer to geography. In many interpretations, it refers to forgetting one's place within the community or forgetting to stay attentive to balance. The lesson is not punishment, but consequence. In some versions of these stories, the land itself becomes quiet when someone loses awareness. Sounds fade. Familiar markers seem different. Time feels stretched. The person may walk for a long time without realizing how far they've gone. These descriptions are symbolic, meant to illustrate how disconnection can distort perception. It's important to understand that indigenous storytelling often uses metaphor rather than literal explanation. A story about someone who vanished into the plains may not describe a physical disappearance at all. It may describe a spiritual or social loss, someone who left their responsibilities, their relationships, or their identity behind. Still, over time, listeners sometimes interpreted these stories more literally, especially as they were retold outside their original cultural context. Another recurring theme in Great Plains oral traditions is attentiveness to subtle changes. Elders often emphasized watching how animals behave, how the wind shifts, how silence changes. These observations were not about fear, but about awareness. The plains can appear calm and predictable, yet they are dynamic and powerful. Stories would describe a traveler who ignored small signs, a sudden quiet, an unusual stillness, a shift in weather, and continued forward without reflection. The lesson was not that something supernatural would happen, but that ignoring change can lead to disorientation. In many traditions, awareness itself is a form of respect. To notice is to participate. To ignore is to separate oneself from the flow of life. Some stories describe figures who appear briefly to travelers, offering guidance or reminders. These figures are often symbolic rather than literal. They may represent conscience, memory, or ancestral knowledge. They do not force action. They simply appear and speak in indirect ways. In oral storytelling, these figures are rarely described in detail. Their appearance is often vague. This vagueness allows listeners to interpret them according to their own understanding. The focus is not on what the figure looks like, but on what the encounter represents. One common motif is the idea that guidance is subtle. It does not shout. It does not demand. It appears briefly and disappears if ignored. This reinforces the broader lesson. Awareness requires attention. Across different plains cultures, there are also stories about people who travel alone for too long without acknowledging community. These stories emphasize that isolation can dull perception. Without others to reflect our experiences back to us, we may lose our bearings. In this sense, being lost is not only physical, it can be emotional or social. The plains, wide and open, become a mirror for this condition. They reflect solitude back to the traveler. Importantly, these stories are not meant to frighten. They are meant to teach balance. Community and awareness are presented as stabilizing forces. Listening, observing, and staying connected are recurring values. Over time, as these stories were passed down, they evolved. Details changed. Settings shifted. But the core themes remained: awareness, balance, respect, attention. When later audiences encounter these stories through books or modern retellings, they sometimes focus on the mystery rather than the message. The symbolic becomes literal. The metaphor becomes a narrative of disappearance. This shift often happens when stories are removed from their cultural framework. Researchers who study oral traditions emphasize that context matters. A story told around a fire, among people who share cultural understanding, functions differently than the same story read in isolation centuries later. In their original form, these stories were educational. They helped young listeners understand how to move through the world thoughtfully. They taught that the land responds to how one moves through it, not magically, but relationally. The Great Plains, with their vast openness, naturally invite reflection. There are few visual boundaries. The sky dominates. Distance can be difficult to judge. This environment shaped storytelling styles that emphasize orientation, patience, and awareness. Some traditions speak of listening to the land, a phrase that refers not to hearing voices, but to paying attention to cues, weather patterns, animal behavior, personal intuition. These were practical skills for survival and harmony. When people ignored these cues, stories say, they might wander longer than intended. They might miss their way, not because the land was hostile, but because they were no longer in dialogue with it. In modern retellings, this idea sometimes transforms into the notion of people disappearing mysteriously. But within the cultural context, the lesson is subtler. It's about attention, humility, and relationship. As storytelling traditions moved beyond their original communities, listeners sometimes merged symbolic teachings with modern fears. The quiet warnings became mysteries. The metaphors became literal. The lessons shifted from balance to suspense. This shift helps explain why stories connected to the Great Plains often feel atmospheric and unresolved. They were never meant to resolve in the way modern narratives do. They were meant to linger, to invite reflection rather than closure. In many indigenous traditions, closure is not the goal. Continuity is. A story lives as long as it is told thoughtfully. Its meaning adapts to the listener. In that sense, stories about people who wander, who lose their way, or who fail to listen are not warnings of doom. They are reminders to stay present. They suggest that awareness is not dramatic. It is quiet. It is practiced daily. It exists in small choices and moments of attention. As this theme traveled through time, it blended with modern storytelling. When people today hear about disappearances or unexplained events in wide open landscapes, their minds reach for familiar patterns. The old stories provide a framework, even if unconsciously. This does not mean the stories predict events. It means they shape how we interpret uncertainty. And that brings us to the heart of why myths connected to the Great Plains continue to resonate. They speak to something universal, the experience of standing in a vast space and realizing how small and uncertain one can feel. They remind us that awareness is a relationship, not a rule. That attention is a form of respect. That meaning often emerges slowly, through reflection rather than revelation. In the next and final continuation, we will bring these ideas together, how ancient storytelling, modern psychology, and contemporary mystery intersect, and why these quiet myths continue to feel relevant today, even in a world full of technology and information. As stories from the Great Plains were passed down through generations, they slowly formed a shared language of meaning rather than a collection of fixed events. These narratives were not meant to be remembered word for word. Instead, they were meant to be understood, each retelling adapted to the listener, the moment, and the lesson that needed to be emphasized. One of the most consistent ideas found across many Plains traditions is the importance of orientation, not only knowing where you are, but knowing who you are in relation to the land and to others. In these stories, losing one's way rarely happens suddenly. It begins subtly, with distraction or imbalance, long before any physical wandering occurs. Elders often describe this process using calm, everyday imagery. A person becomes too focused on their own thoughts. They stop noticing the rhythm of their surroundings. They walk faster than their awareness. Over time, they no longer recognize familiar markers. The land has not changed, but their relationship to it has. These stories were often told to younger listeners as lessons in attentiveness. They taught that paying attention is not a passive act, but an active form of respect. Listening to wind, noticing shifts in temperature, observing animals, and staying aware of one's inner state were all considered essential skills. In this context, many myths that later became interpreted as mysterious or unsettling were originally educational. They were meant to communicate what happens when awareness fades. They were not warnings of punishment, but illustrations of consequence. Some stories describe travelers who begin to feel out of sync with their surroundings. Time feels uneven. Distance feels distorted. Familiar landmarks seem different. These experiences were often described metaphorically, not as supernatural events, but as signs that a person had lost alignment with their environment. In oral tradition, metaphor is a tool of understanding. Saying that the land grew quiet or that the path no longer answered does not mean something literal occurred. It means the traveler failed to interpret signals they once understood. Silence becomes a symbol for disconnection. Across different plains cultures, there are also stories emphasizing the importance of humility. These tales often describe individuals who believed they could travel alone without guidance or community. Overconfidence, not danger, becomes the central issue. The lesson is subtle. Knowledge is shared, not owned. When these individuals ignore advice or dismiss small signs, they begin to drift, not necessarily physically, but socially and mentally. They stop checking in. They stop asking questions. They assume understanding instead of seeking it. This theme resonates strongly with modern audiences because it mirrors everyday experience. People today often move quickly, rely on routines, and assume familiarity equals safety. The old stories gently challenge that assumption, reminding listeners that awareness requires effort. Another recurring idea in Great Plains storytelling is that guidance rarely comes as commands. Instead, it appears as hints, repetitions, or quiet reminders. A repeated sound, a recurring image, a familiar pattern appearing in an unexpected place. These are not presented as threats but as invitations to pause. In traditional storytelling, these moments were not meant to create fear. They were meant to encourage reflection. If a person noticed such a sign, they were expected to stop, reassess, and reconnect with their surroundings or their community. When listeners today hear these elements, they sometimes interpret them through a modern lens of mystery. Repetition becomes something ominous. familiarity becomes surveillance. But in the original context, repetition was often understood as a call to awareness. Elders used repetition in teaching deliberately. Repeating a phrase, a rhythm, or a story allowed meaning to deepen over time. What seemed simple at first could reveal more layers as the listener matured. This is why many stories from the Great Plains do not offer clear resolutions. They are designed to be revisited. Their meaning evolves with the listener's experience. Another important aspect of these traditions is the role of balance. Balance between movement and stillness, between solitude and community, between attention outward and reflection inward. Losing balance, even temporarily, is a common theme in stories about wandering or disorientation. In some narratives, a person becomes so focused on reaching a destination that they stop noticing their surroundings. In others, they become so absorbed in their thoughts that they forget to observe the land. In both cases, the result is the same: disconnection. These stories do not portray this disconnection as moral failure. Rather, it is presented as a natural risk of being human. Everyone loses balance at times. The purpose of the story is to remind, not to judge. In modern interpretations, the vastness of the Great Plains often symbolizes isolation. Endless horizons can evoke both freedom and vulnerability. For people unfamiliar with such landscapes, the openness itself can feel unsettling. For those who lived there, however, the plains were full of meaning and subtle cues. Traditional knowledge emphasized reading those cues. Changes in wind, animal movement, cloud formations, and even silence were forms of information. Awareness was a skill developed over time, not an instinct that automatically protected someone. When this cultural context is removed, stories about people losing their way can sound mysterious or ominous. But within their original framework, they were practical teachings woven into narrative form. Many elders stress that stories should not be taken literally or detached from their purpose. They were tools for teaching values: attentiveness, humility, patience, and respect for interconnectedness. This is why similar themes appear across different nations of the Great Plains, even when details differ. The environment shaped shared concerns, and storytelling became a way to transmit survival knowledge across generations. As these stories entered written form through outside collectors, some nuance was lost. Oral storytelling relies on tone, pacing, and relationship between teller and listener. Written versions freeze stories in one form, often emphasizing plot over purpose. Later readers, unfamiliar with the cultural context, sometimes interpreted symbolic elements as literal mysteries. Over time, these interpretations blended with modern ideas of unexplained phenomena, creating new narratives layered on top of old ones. This blending explains why modern audiences sometimes associate plains myths with disappearance or unexplained events. It is not that the original stories were about such things, but that their symbolic language lends itself to reinterpretation. Understanding this helps separate meaning from myth. It allows appreciation without distortion. At their core, these stories are about awareness, of self, of environment, of relationships. They teach that losing awareness can lead to confusion, and that regaining it requires humility and attention. They also emphasize that knowledge is not static. It is passed through listening, observing, and reflecting. Stories change because people change. As these traditions continue to be shared today, many educators and cultural keepers emphasize respectful retelling. They encourage listeners to focus on values rather than sensational elements. This approach allows ancient stories to remain relevant without turning them into something they were never meant to be. In the next part, we will continue exploring how these symbolic themes influenced later storytelling traditions, how they intersect with modern ideas about mystery and disappearance, and why the human mind continues to return to these narratives when faced with uncertainty. As these stories continued to travel through time, something subtle began to happen. They started to blend with newer ways of thinking, newer fears, and newer forms of storytelling. The original lessons about awareness and balance slowly mixed with modern ideas about mystery, uncertainty, and disappearance. This blending did not happen all at once. It happened quietly, across generations, as oral traditions met written records and later digital media. In many Great Plains communities, elders have explained that stories were never meant to be frozen. They were meant to move, adapt, and respond to the needs of the people listening. A story told to children would sound different than the same story told to adults. A story told during difficult times would emphasize different lessons than one told during peace. Because of this, the same narrative could carry multiple meanings without contradiction. When people today hear stories about travelers who lost their way or failed to notice important signs, they often interpret them through a modern lens shaped by uncertainty and anxiety. But traditionally, these stories functioned more like mirrors. They reflected inner states rather than external threats. One common theme across Plains traditions is the idea that awareness is relational. It does not exist in isolation. A person's awareness depends on their relationship with others, with the land, and with themselves. When one of these relationships weakens, confusion can follow. Stories sometimes describe characters who become overly focused on their own thoughts or goals. They stop listening to others. They stop observing small changes around them. The land in these stories does not punish them. It simply stops offering guidance. The person continues walking but without orientation. This idea is often misunderstood as something ominous, when in fact it is closer to a moral lesson. It teaches that awareness must be practiced continuously. It is not a permanent state. In traditional contexts, these stories were often followed by discussion. Elders would ask listeners what they thought the story meant. Children were encouraged to reflect rather than memorize. Meaning emerged through conversation. This aspect is important because it shows that these narratives were interactive. They were not meant to deliver fixed conclusions. They were meant to develop critical thinking, attentiveness, and humility. When such stories are removed from that interactive context, they can appear more mysterious or unresolved than intended. Without discussion, symbolism can harden into plot. Metaphor can turn into literal interpretation. This process helps explain why modern retellings sometimes focus on disappearance rather than on awareness. The unresolved quality becomes the focus, rather than the lesson embedded within it. Another recurring element in these traditions is the idea of transition. The plains themselves are transitional spaces, neither forest nor mountain, but something in between. Many stories set in this environment emphasize moments of crossing, change, or passage. These transitions are not always physical. They can represent changes in responsibility, maturity, or perspective. A person who loses the way is often someone in transition, struggling to adapt to a new role or phase of life. In this sense, stories about wandering or disorientation function as metaphors for internal change. They describe what it feels like to be between identities, between understandings, or between stages of life. This interpretation aligns with how many cultures use storytelling to guide people through transitions. Rather than giving direct instructions, stories provide symbolic maps. Listeners are invited to recognize themselves in the narrative and draw meaning from it. As time passed and these stories were shared beyond their original communities, their symbolic nature was sometimes overlooked. External audiences, unfamiliar with the cultural framework, focused on the surface elements, the wandering, the silence, the disappearance, and interpreted them through lenses shaped by modern mystery storytelling. This is not necessarily wrong, but it is incomplete. Understanding this gap helps explain why modern audiences feel drawn to these stories. They contain ambiguity, and ambiguity invites interpretation. They leave space for the listener to project fears, questions, or curiosity. At the same time, Responsible retelling requires acknowledging that these stories are not about fear for its own sake. They are about relationship to place, to people, and to oneself. In many Plains traditions, the idea of being lost is not permanent. It is a state that can be reversed through awareness, guidance, and reconnection. Even when stories end without explicit resolution, the implication is not hopelessness, but reflection. This perspective is important when discussing disappearance-related narratives today. It shifts focus away from sensational conclusions and toward understanding how humans make meaning in uncertain situations. Modern psychology echoes some of these ideas. Research on attention and perception shows that humans constantly filter information. We notice what aligns with our expectations and ignore much else. When our internal state changes, stress, distraction, isolation, that filtering changes too. This can affect how we interpret our surroundings. A familiar environment may suddenly feel unfamiliar. Patterns may appear more pronounced. Neutral events may feel significant. None of this requires danger. It is part of how perception works. Traditional stories captured this phenomenon in symbolic form long before scientific language existed to describe it. Another important theme found in plain storytelling is the role of listening. Listening not just to sounds but to context, listening to others, listening to one's own uncertainty. Silence is not portrayed as empty but as meaningful. In many stories, silence is where insight emerges. When characters pause instead of pushing forward, they regain clarity. When they ignore silence, confusion deepens. This contrasts with modern tendencies to fill silence quickly, to seek immediate answers, or to resolve ambiguity as fast as possible. The stories suggest a different approach: patience. This may be one reason such narratives feel timeless. They speak to experiences that remain relevant regardless of technology or era. As these ideas entered contemporary storytelling, they were often reframed in documentary or reflective formats. Writers and filmmakers began to explore the emotional resonance of unresolved stories rather than their mechanics. The focus shifted from what happened to what it means to not know. This shift mirrors how audiences engage with these stories today. Many are less interested in definitive answers and more interested in understanding uncertainty itself. The Great Plains, with their vast open spaces and quiet horizons, become a powerful metaphor in this context. They represent openness, possibility, and also the limits of perception. You can see far, yet still not see everything. This metaphor helps explain why stories connected to this region often emphasize patience, humility, and attentiveness. The land teaches through experience rather than instruction. As these themes continue to resonate, they influence how modern storytellers frame narratives about disappearance, awareness, and uncertainty. The influence is subtle but persistent. By understanding the cultural roots of these ideas, we can approach such stories with greater respect and nuance. We can appreciate their depth without turning them into something they were never meant to be. In the final part of this series, we will bring together these threads: oral tradition, psychology, symbolism, and modern interpretation, to reflect on why stories about awareness and losing one's way continue to matter, and how they can be told responsibly in the present day. As these ideas come together, what becomes most clear is that stories about losing one's way were never meant to frighten. They were meant to slow people down. Across many traditions of the Great Plains, storytelling functioned as a pause, a moment to reflect on how attention, awareness, and connection shape human experience. When elders spoke of travelers who wandered too far or failed to notice subtle signs, they were not describing punishment or danger in a literal sense. They were describing imbalance, a moment when a person moved faster than their awareness, or when their focus drifted away from the relationships that grounded them. The loss, described in these stories, was often internal before it was external. This idea becomes especially meaningful when we consider how modern audiences interpret similar narratives. Today, When people hear about disappearances or unresolved stories, the instinct is often to search for causes, explanations, or hidden forces. But traditional storytelling from the plains invites a different approach, reflection instead of resolution. These stories suggest that not everything meaningful can be reduced to an answer. Some experiences exist to teach attentiveness, humility, and patience rather than to be solved. In this way, the myths and oral traditions of the Great Plains align closely with insights from modern psychology. Researchers who study attention and perception emphasize that awareness is not a constant state. It fluctuates. It depends on stress, environment, focus, and connection. People can become disconnected from their surroundings without realizing it, especially when routines dominate daily life. This does not imply danger. It implies human limitation. The traditional stories express this limitation symbolically. A traveler becomes distracted. A path becomes unclear. A familiar landscape feels unfamiliar. These moments reflect internal states as much as external ones. They are reminders to slow down, to notice, and to reconnect. Over time, as such stories were shared beyond their original cultural context, they were sometimes interpreted through a lens shaped by mystery and suspense. The symbolic became literal. The lesson became a plot. The quiet became dramatic. This shift is understandable, but it changes the purpose of the story. Understanding that shift helps us approach these narratives more respectfully. It allows us to appreciate their depth without turning them into something they were never meant to be. It also helps explain why these stories continue to resonate in modern discussions about uncertainty, awareness, and disappearance. At their core, these traditions are about relationships, between people and place, between attention and understanding, between experience and meaning. They remind us that awareness is not automatic. It is cultivated. It requires presence. This perspective also reframes how we think about modern uncertainty. When people today speak about feeling uneasy or noticing subtle changes, they are often engaging in the same human process described in older stories. They are trying to interpret their environment using limited information. They are negotiating between intuition and reason. The difference is that modern culture often demands clear answers. It is uncomfortable with ambiguity. Stories that do not resolve neatly can feel unsatisfying. Yet unresolved stories persist because they reflect real life more accurately than tidy conclusions ever could. In the context of the Great Plains, the landscape itself reinforces this lesson. The horizon is wide, the view is open, yet distance is deceptive. What looks close may be far. What seems empty may be full of life. Orientation requires patience, observation, and humility. This symbolism carries through the stories told about the region. They teach that understanding comes not from control, but from relationship, from paying attention, from listening more than asserting. As modern storytellers revisit these themes, there is an opportunity to do so with care. Rather than framing old narratives as sources of fear, they can be presented as reflections on awareness and responsibility. Rather than focusing on disappearance, they can emphasize perception and connection. This approach honors the original purpose of the stories while allowing them to speak to contemporary audiences. When we listen this way, the idea of losing the way becomes less about being taken or erased and more about drifting from attentiveness. The solution, implied again and again, is not panic but presence. Presence with the land. Presence with others. Presence with oneself. In this sense, the stories offer guidance rather than warning. They invite listeners to slow down, to notice small changes, to remain connected. They remind us that meaning often emerges quietly, not through dramatic events but through subtle awareness. This is why such narratives endure. They are not bound to a specific time or place. They adapt to each generation's questions. They offer a framework for thinking about uncertainty without demanding conclusions, and perhaps that is their greatest strength. They do not claim to explain everything. They leave space for reflection. They allow the listener to sit with ambiguity rather than resolve it too quickly. In a world that constantly pushes for answers, these stories suggest another path,